Now we're going to investigate the Google Poly API, which is an API we'll be using to get 3D object information for our app. This is an API provided by Google, and you can find the documentation on developers.google.com/poly. First thing you need to do is click this button right here to get an API key, so go ahead and click that and get your API key, and then jump back over to your code, and let's go into the constants directory, and we will create a new file called apiKeys.js. And inside of this, we will put all of our API keys. So we'll export default and create your object here. And let's create a property called Google Poly and put whatever API key you created in this string right here. All right, I've just added my API key, and remember to keep your API keys a secret so that other people can't use them. Since we're not going to be using the app for a little while we do this, I'm going to go ahead and close my preview of the app right here. And let's jump back over to the Google Poly documentation. So it gives us access to 3D objects. It'll give us all the 3D object files that we need to render them in our augmented reality app. It'll also give us some screenshots and a little bit other information that we might find useful. If we come down here to guides, we can click Poly API and get some more information about it. The API, as it says here, allows you to list assets, list your assets, or get a specific asset. What we want to do is use the list assets API because we're going to allow users to search for different assets, and then we'll display whatever they've chosen. So just a quick overview of this. Here's the request that you use for the API, and here are some parameters you can provide it. You can give it keywords, which is probably what we'll be using for the search. You can specify certain categories like animals or technology. You can specify a format if you want only a specific type of 3D object format. Page size controls how many results you get back from each search. And then page token is a way to have different pages of data. So if we say that our page size is 10 and there's a total of 100 results of that search, we would need to use the page token to get page 2 and page 3 and so on. Down here it gives you an example of what the response will look like. We'll look at this a little bit more deeply in just a second, but the documentation here is pretty good, and it would be wise of you to take a look at it. Another thing you can do is use the Google APIs Explorer right here, and if you look up the Poly API, you can actually test out API calls. So we're using the list API, so I'll click that. And here we can just type in any kind of search parameters that we want. So for keywords, we could look up duck and click, let's set our page size to be 5, and we'll click execute, and it'll actually run this API call. And down here, it gives you an example of what the results would look like. It also shows you what the request itself would look like. We would just call a get on this URL, except replace this with our API key. And as you can see down here, we get an array of assets, and each asset has a display name, an author, a description, some information about when it was created, and then this formats array actually has the 3D object files. So there's a .obj, a material file, here's some additional files and different formats. All right, so let's go back over to our code. I'll make this a little bit larger so we have some more room. And what I want to do is go into the API folder and create a file called googlepoly.js. And here we're going to build out a little sample, a little class for working with the Google Poly API. So let's do export default class Google Poly, and let's create a constructor, and the constructor is going to take the API key. So whenever we create a new instance of this class, we'll give it the API key, and then we'll store it in a property called this .api key. And that allows you to use it if you have a secondary API key or you want to use it in a separate project with a different API key. Next thing I want to do is create a function called getQuery URL. And what that's going to do is take an API key and a few other parameters that we decide we want to use, and it'll return us the URL to perform the query. And the URL would be something like this. So why don't we actually just copy this and paste it into our code, and we can look at it as a reference while we're building this out. I also want to make this a static function since we're passing in the API key and it doesn't need any access to any member variables. At least I don't think it will. All right, so let's create a variable here called base URL. And that's going to be this portion of the URL that never changes no matter what the parameters are. So we'll set that. And then we're going to build out a URL based on the different parameters that we want to give it. So as a review, here are all the parameters that are possible. And for our application, we're going to let users search using a free text search box. And whatever they type in, we'll just put into the keywords parameter and show them those results. So let's make a new variable called URL. And that's going to be equal to the base URL plus key equals, and I'm getting this from here. It doesn't matter what order you put the parameters in. I always start with the API key so I don't forget it. So we'll put key equals that plus the API key that we were given in the function. And then we'll say URL plus equal, which adds on to the URL. And parameters should be separated with an ampersand. You can also use query parameter building libraries if you want, but this one will be simple enough that I don't really mind doing it myself. So let's take a look at our parameter options. I think for this app we want to set a page size so that we don't load too many all at one time. So let's just hard code our page size to 10. And back over here, it's got this max complexity parameter, which is an enum, and it takes medium, simple, or complex. Let's hard code it to medium so that we don't get too complicated graphics and overload our application. So we'll set ampersand max complexity equals medium. The other thing I want to hard code is the format of the results that we get. I want to limit these results to OBJ files. The other formats could potentially work, but I'm only familiar with OBJs, and so I only want to give users options that have an OBJ file format. So we'll set ampersand format equals OBJ, and let's see, we also want to add the keywords. So let's pass in keywords into our function. We'll say ampersand keywords equals. And since the keywords will come from user input, you need to make sure that you clean that input and don't allow any sort of unsafe characters to get in. So the way you can do that is by calling encode URI component and giving it the passed in parameter. And since we're going to support multiple pages, we also want to pass in a next page token. But this one will be optional since the very first page won't have a next page token. So we'll say if next page token is passed in, then we're going to add that to our URL. And I believe the parameter, yes, is called page token. So we'll say ampersand page token equals and next page token. And finally, we will return the URL. So this function should give us a query URL with a given API key, keywords, and an optional next page token. And another thing I just thought of, just to be safe, if the keywords for some reason were blank, we probably don't want to say keywords equals blank. So why don't we put this around an if statement as well. So we'll say if keywords are passed in, then we will add the keywords to that parameter. All right, now we want to make another function that actually gets the results. So why don't we call it get search results. And this will take a keywords parameter and a next page token. This one's not, I don't want to make this one static. So in that case, we'll have access to this .api key, but we'll still need keywords and next page token so we can build our query URL. And what this function is going to do is it's going to build the query URL and then call the API and return the results. So let's first get the URL. So we'll call the static function via Google Poly.getQueryURL. And the first argument is API key, which we have right here as this.api key. And the next two are keywords and next page token. So now we have the query URL that we need to use. And since it's just a basic GET request, which you can tell from the API Explorer right here, we can just use fetch to get the results. So we'll call fetch, we'll say return fetch, give it the URL, and you need to usually do these kind of thing where you convert it to JSON. So we'll say then function response will return response.json. And then another then, which has the data itself. And what we want to do with the data is take a look at the data that we're given. And it gives us an array called assets. Let's see if it gives us anything else if we scroll all the way down to the bottom. It's also got a next page token and a total size, which I think is the total number of results. So I think for this function, all we want to do is return the array of assets. And later on, we'll come back and grab the next page token and figure out how to handle our pagination. So we don't want to return the whole data. We only want to return data.assets. And since we're handling this with promises, the way we should do that is return promise.resolve data.assets. So now when we call this, we can use the normal promise syntax and we'll be given the data.assets. So that should be enough for us to test it out. So let's go back to our home screen and we want to import Google Poly from, it was an API/Google Poly. And remember, we need to go up one level because we're currently in the screens folder. Now let's create a constructor here. And remember, you always need to call super props. And let's create an instance of the Google Poly API class that we just made. So we'll say this.Google Poly equals new Google Poly. And we need to pass in the API key, which we have in our constants/API keys file, which we also need to import. So right here, we'll import API keys from /constants/API keys. Now back down here, we'll call API keys.Google Poly, and we'll save that. And let's check the Expo window right here. When we do console.log, some messages will appear down here that we can take a look at. So I'll make this a little bit smaller again. Now that we've initialized our Google Poly object, we can call this.googlepoly.getSearchResults, which is the function we just created. And remember, it takes a keywords and an optional next page token parameter. So for our keywords, we will give it duck, and next page token, since we don't have one because this is the first page, we will pass in a blank. And then we could say .then function, and remember, it's giving us the assets. And inside of here, we should have our assets. Let's just double check by doing a console.log assets. And if we refresh, and I think I may need to run it on my phone, so just 1 second. Yeah, it closed out. So I'm going to scan it on my phone. And all it's going to do is load the app, which should go straight to the home screen, which will call our home screen constructor. It'll generate the Google Poly object, call get search results, and give us the assets. And I've just realized that I made a typo. If I come back over here, it's saying that I spelled keywords wrong. Oh, here it is. Okay. I accidentally misspelled keywords right here, so I need to fix that and rerun it. Okay, so the simulator has launched, and as you can see over here, it tells me that it can't run OpenGL in the simulator. That's what we expected, but all we really care about is the console. And as you can see right here, it has printed out a bunch of JSON data, which is the data from the API call. And if you don't believe me, just as a double check, I'll pull this over here and I'll reload the application by using the Command plus R button. It's going to relaunch, and here we go. Here is all of our asset data. Okay, so one thing that we're going to do that I think would be convenient is let's take a single asset and copy that data into a file so we can use that as a reference as we're building the app and we don't have to constantly be calling the API. So there's a few ways we can do that. The way that I want to do it is just grab an asset here. We'll just say assets 0, and we'll create a variable called JSON, and we'll say JSON.stringify, and we'll give it the first asset. And what that's going to do is take this asset and convert it to a JSON string, and then we're just going to display that string in the console, and we'll just from the console copy and paste it somewhere. So I'll save this. I'm going to clear my console here, and as you can see, we've got that JSON data in a big string. So we'll just copy this, and why don't we put this in our assets folder? So we'll come into assets, we've got fonts and images. Let's create a new file called, a new folder called objects. And since we were searching for ducks, I'll assume that the first asset was a duck. So let's create a new file called duckObject.json, and inside of here we'll paste that string. And I'm sure there's a way to format it automatically for you in this code editor, but I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to put a few line breaks in here, not for the whole string, but just so we can look at a few things in here. There's another property called thumbnail somewhere in here. There it is. I'll put that. Now we can kind of read this. And I think the data that we really need is thumbnail, formats, and probably the display name and the author name. And it says Turkey Day, Happy Turkey Day, hashtag turkey. So this object may actually be a turkey. So why don't we just rename it to turkey object. .json. All right, so just as a way of checking that our object is working properly and that we got all the data we wanted, let's try to display the thumbnail as an image in our app. So if we come over here, we can see that the turkey has a property called thumbnail. Let me just pull this over here. And the thumbnail object actually has a few properties. One's called relative path, one is called URL, and one is called content type. Format some of this stuff too. So I think all we need to do is grab the URL out of the thumbnail property, and that should be in a format that we can display in an image. Let's come back over to our home screen, and let's import turkey object from assets/objects/turkey object.json. That should give us access to the turkey object data. I'm going to save that and save that. And down here in our render method, temporarily we will comment out the expo graphics.view, and instead we'll return a normal view with a flex 1. And inside of here we will put an image. And let's double check that we have image in our imports. We don't, so we need to import image from React Native so we can use it. And image takes a source property with a URI property, and the URI in our case will be turkey object.thumbnail.url. And keep in mind that came from, here's the object. We want to get the thumbnail.url property. And we also need to set a width and height, so let's give it a style. We'll say width of 150 and height of 150. And let's save that, and hopefully we won't have any errors. And there you go. There's our thumbnail. This is what the 3D object should look like. It's not the 3D object itself. It's just a thumbnail or a screenshot, but this is what we can expect once we've loaded the 3D model. So let's comment this out in case we want to use it later, and uncomment this section so we can go back to having our camera.